I'm going to have to rattle through this because there is a lot to say. So, yeah, if you want to check out the content warnings, because it's a lot. We're not going to have a good time, sorry. Yeah. I'll try and avoid the language, but yeah. Right, let's get started. So, what is the Yakuza? You probably have some idea. The simple answer is it's a member of an organised crime group in Japan. They're formed into families, frequently compared to Italian and Sicilian mafia or Chinese triads, both being just organised crime groups, but also because they have very similar structures and they use a lot of ritualized elements in their internal practices. So the word Yakuza itself comes from Yakuza, which is the old Japanese for the numbers of one of the worst hands you can get in a card game, which is called Oichukabu. It's popular with gamblers on Tokaido Road, which is where some of the origins of the Yakuza lie. Oichukabu is one of the games you can play in the Yakuza or Like a Dragon series. So if you have played it, you might know if you get a hand, well, the aim is to get a hand where the digits, where the last digit adds up to 9. And that means that if you get a hand which is 10 or 20 in total, that's the worst hand you can get. So one of the combinations that you can do this is 893. In Old Japanese, that was Yakuza. The implication is therefore that the Yakuza are something worthless. Unsurprisingly, members of the Yakuza aren't particularly keen on that. They prefer to call themselves Ninkyo Dantai, which means chivalrous groups, or Gokudo, which means the extreme path. Police, on the other hand, like to use the term Boryokudan, which means violent group. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on all of those terms later on. Personally, I will be using the term Yakuza throughout because it's the one that's, as Westerners, we are most familiar with. It's also a lot easier to say than most of those. So the earliest origins of the Yakuza are a little bit difficult to pin down for various reasons. Groups that have violent or criminal elements have existed throughout the history of Japan, as they have throughout the history of everywhere in the world, because people are people. So it's difficult to identify at which point you would call them organised criminals. There are some theories, however, that this point might have been during the latter half or latter parts of the Edo era and the Tokugawa shogunate. At that point, the country was experiencing a sustained period of peace. And that meant that the samurai class, whose basically purpose was to go to war for their leaders, they had nothing to do. And because they had nothing to do, they also weren't getting paid. And as a result, they were forming into kind of roving groups of ronin and engaging in banditry because they had no money, they had nothing to eat, so they were robbing people. They would also take part in a very unpleasant practice, which was known as tsujigiri, where they would prove the sharpness of their swords by just chopping random people's heads off. They like to call themselves the Hatamoto Yako, which means servants of the shogun. The villagers that they were terrorizing called them the Kabuki Mono, which is the crazy people. This is posited as one of the origins of the Yakuza. However, modern Yakuza say, no, we weren't those people. We were the ones who fought against those people. We were the Machi Yako. These were the ordinary villagers that would fight against the Hatamoto Yako, that would try and protect their villages from these roving gangs. The Yakuza do like to see themselves as protectors of the downtrodden. There's a couple of particularly legendary Machiyako. There's one named Wanand Kisaburo, who supposedly cut off his own arm in penance for having an affair with a woman, but still managed to protect his village. And there was also Chobai Banzuin, who was a man who opened and profited from a gambling den, but lived according to a code of chivalry and accepted his death at the hands of the Hatamoto Yaku with grace and honour. Both of these sets of groups were disbanded around the late 17th century because the shogunate was getting a little bit concerned about it and made efforts to stop these activities. Up to this point, it's a little bit of time before a clearer link to today's Yakuza emerges. So in the 18th century, we see the formation of another two groups of people, and they've got a much more direct line to today's Yakuza. These are the tekiya, or peddlers, and the bakuto, or gamblers. So both of these groups formed along the Tokaido Road, which was the primary road of trade. It was also the road where, at this point, the shogun required people to come and sort of register themselves regularly, so they would always have to travel into the capital, and the Tokaido Road was generally the road they used to do this. The peddlers would trade along this road, and the managers of the gambling houses would set up gambling houses along the road as entertainment for the people who were travelling. The peddlers would sell crap quality goods, basically, or they would sell things that looked good but weren't. For example, they would sell you quality bonsai tree. You get home, you find out it didn't have any roots. Or they'd pretend to be really drunk and say, "Oh, I'm going to sell this to you for rock bottom prices," and actually the price was about accurate for the quality of the goods you were getting. There is actually still a very heavy link between stalls at Japanese festivals and the Yakuza. They are still very frequently run by Yakuza groups. Now, the tekiya were predominantly made up from members from Japan's lowest social classes, particularly the burakumin. Now, the burakumin, at this time there was a caste system in Japan, and the very lowest caste was burakumin. These were people who came from other countries, like China and Korea in particular, and also those who had occupations that were regarded by Shinto and Buddhism as unclean in some way. Usually this was if they worked in any way with death. So butchers, tanners, people who worked in the funerary industry and actually had direct contact with the bodies, they were seen as being unclean. These people suffered from extreme discrimination. And so banding together into these groups of tekiya allowed them to feel a sense of community that otherwise they weren't being given. It also meant that they could move away from the places where they were known to be burakumin, and they could move to a place where they weren't known, and so they wouldn't experience the same level of discrimination. Now, as they formed into organised groups, they developed a hierarchical structure based on feudal status, and that has actually survived, and that is the basis of the hierarchy that exists in today's Yakuza. They also started to develop certain ethical codes, which similarly has continued on. They also started working together, so groups of tekiya would work together to ensure relative harmony between groups. They'd help each other get good spots at the local festivals, and they would also, people would travel they would make sure that these people got reasonable accommodation, they felt safe. But there were still criminal elements, and groups would start battling each other. The bakuto, on the other hand, the managers of the gambling houses, they were initially formed by government officials because the government wanted to recoup some of the money that they were paying to, it was often irrigation and construction workers. Government wanted that money back, so what they did was they organised these gambling houses as a way for people to spend the money through their entertainment, so it just ended up going in a circle. They also developed into more organised groups with codes and hierarchical structures. And obviously, it was easier for them to make that money if the games were rigged. So, obviously, you've got the criminal elements developing there as well. It was the Bakuto that started up with the tradition of the yubitsumi, which is the finger cutting, which we'll talk about later as well. So both of these groups, the Tekiya and the Bakuto, both had kind of a relationship with the authorities. They would have a certain level of cooperation because it ended up benefiting both sides. And actually, until relatively recently, the police in Japan would still classify modern Yakuza into either Tekiya or Bakuto, depending on which was the primary source of income for each group. So the groups continued their activities through the end of the Edo period and into the Meiji Restoration, which started in 1868. During this period, another character that the modern Yakuza like to claim as one of their own rose to notoriety. This is Shimizu no Jirocho, probably the most famous real-life gangster in Japanese history. He's still taught about in schools. Supposedly born in 1820 on New Year's Day, there was a belief at the time that anyone who was born on New Year's Day would either become the worst of the worst or the best of the best. And Jirocho's father kind of didn't really want to take that gamble, so he put him up for adoption. Furthermore, he met a monk when he was kind of in his teens, and this monk said, "You're not going to live till your 26th birthday." And Jirocho was like, "All right, fine, if I'm not going to live a long time, I'm going to live and have a good time." Decided to turn to crime. He did a lot of crime. He ended up with, he formed his own gang. He ended up with, some sources suggest, over 600 members stationed at 9 points along the Tokaido Road. The legend states that they acted like the Machi-Yakos. They were protecting the locals against thieves, against the gangs of Ronin, against the Bakuto groups that were kind of more criminal. When it became evident that the Tokugawa shogunate was reaching its end, Jirocho decided to throw in his lot with the supporters of the emperor because he was quite right-wing and he approved of Japan's isolationist status at the time. He didn't want the country to be opened up, he wanted things to be kept within. Turns out that didn't pan out because the emperor was actually quite keen on opening up the country. But it did work out on a personal level for Jirocho because all of his crimes got pardoned. He ended up becoming a very powerful and respected figure in his local community. Ironically, given his nationalistic standpoint, he ended up opening a school that taught English. And then he decided to open a jail. Go figure. He died in 1893, and his grave is actually still kind of is a tourist site, but it's not quite an enshrinement, but he is a very respected figure in Japanese history, and people will go and visit his grave.
So much for the early death.
I know, right? Modern historians disagree with the legend. They say he was not a noble figure, and in fact he was using oppression of the local farmers and violence and intimidation to control the local area. He was not, unfortunately, the only gang leader who had ultra-nationalistic tendencies. The tensions with the opening of Japan caused these ideas to swell, particularly amongst disgruntled ex-samurai. And one such member of a former samurai family was Mitsuru Toyama. You can see his It's this fellow there in the middle. That's the Dark Ocean Society, which is the group that he founded. He grew up in poverty because, as I said, samurai no longer had purpose and therefore no money, no income. And he took part in a lot of the samurai uprisings that were happening at this time. If you've seen the Tom Cruise film, The Last Samurai, that's what that film is about. It was the last kind of, the dying gasp of the samurai trying to create, or trying to maintain some kind of power. So he decided, as a result of being involved in these uprisings, he was jailed by the Edo, by the Meiji government. After which point he formed his own nationalistic group, started to gather his own following. They were used as a workforce, but also as muscle. They took part in a lot of strike breaking, particularly in mines. He also somehow got himself a reputation as a hero for the downtrodden, because he got a lot of money, he would just hand it out in the streets to random people, and obviously the random people involved were pretty keen on that, and like, yeah, this is a great guy. The local politicians respected his standing and feared his use of violence, and this only increased as he formed the Dark Ocean Society. The official purpose of the Dark Ocean Society was to revere the emperor, love and respect the nation of Japan, and defend the rights of its people. In reality, it used terror, assassination, and blackmail to exert power over the government. Government officials would use them as bodyguards, as strong armers, and as legitimate labourers. So this group saw themselves as being of a higher class than the Tekiya and the Bakuto because they had influence over the government. And they actually ended up forming an intelligence network which operated in China, Korea, and Manchuria, as it existed at the time. And they would create unrest in those countries, which ended up weakening the countries and allowing Japan to enter in and begin colonization. They were particularly instrumental in the invasion of Korea. Toyama was trying to create a more right-wing government. And even though the 1920s were actually quite a liberal period in Japan, Toyama's influence did serve to shift that towards more right-wing ways of thinking in the 1930s. He died in 1944, proud of having seen Japan invade much of Asia, but at the same time, the events following the bombing of Pearl Harbor caused the Japanese government to start severing ties with these right-wing gangsters. So after the end of the Second World War, Japan was in tatters. It was occupied by the US. The nationalistic gangs lost a lot of their power, and it was time for other criminal groups to take advantage of that. This mainly took the form of the Sangokujin, which is foreign groups. They would run black market activities. So these were people who were living in Japan but originally from countries like China and Korea who had been brought over as a result of the occupation of those countries by Japan. These people were given more freedom by the Americans than a lot of actual national Japanese, because the Americans thought they could trust them more. And the Yakuza groups, as they existed at the time, were fighting against the Sangokujin. There were violent outbursts. There was one where the Sangokujin had occupied a police station and were ousted by the Yakuza, and that meant that the police were therefore in the debt of the Yakuza. And they were once again positing themselves as heroes to the common man against the hated enemy of these Chinese and Koreans who were obviously worth less than Japanese. At around this time, there was a new kind of group that began to form. They were called the Gurentai. They were more ruthless than the existing gangs. They were more likely to use violence. And they were seeking to fill the power vacuum that had been left by the groups who were previously influencing the government. Unfortunately, the period of time that didn't have overt Yakuza influence on the Japanese government was very short. Attempts to stop this kind of redevelopment of influence tended to be responded to with arson, with violence, and blackmail. Yakuza continued to flourish as Japan's economy recovered after the war, and new avenues of opportunity, like tourism, started opening up to them. And after the occupying forces of the Americans who'd been stifling their activities started to leave, that meant that they were able to increase even further in power and numbers. This led to the peak of Yakuza membership, which was in 1963, when 184,100 members and associates were recorded. Membership has gone downhill ever since. You can see on the chart there, membership from 1991 down to 2021. This is mostly due to concerted efforts by police and government to crack down on the Yakuza, but also the COVID pandemic accelerated the decline because, just like the rest of us, they couldn't do their activities, and it was very difficult for them to come back to it. Is that a question?
Yeah. Has organised crime in Japan gone down, or have the Yakuza been replaced by a different gang?
It's difficult to say because we know these numbers because the Yakuza would actually tell the police who their members were.
Right.
They mean to do that?
Yes. We'll get onto that later.
Okay, no more questions.
Yeah, so I can't answer that because it might be the case that there is other forms of organised crime, but they aren't. It's not as quantifiable. Young men don't see them as being cool and glamorous anymore either. So they're a lot less inclined to join. The average age of Yakuza members is now 53. They are literally dying out. So going on to some of their traditions and rituals, obviously one of the most famous things about the Yakuza is their tattoos, which can take up almost their entire bodies, including the genitals. They're known as irezumi. If you talk to Yakuza members, or people that have talked to me, I obviously haven't, but people who've talked to Yakuza members, they don't like you just calling them tattoos. They are very specific that they are irezumi, because these have a more spiritual meaning. They're very specific. It's also, they're traditionally done with the stick and poke method, the old-fashioned way, although increasingly members will opt for the tattoo gun because it's easier. But the stick and poke, part of the reason for this is the stick and poke method is very, very painful. And it's seen as a badge of honour that you have been able to tolerate the pain of having this much of your body covered with something that's really, really painful to do. However, the traditional method is also a lot harder to keep clean and hygienic. And most of the Yakuza who have, well, not most, but a significant portion actually have contracted hepatitis B from having these done, which also has contributed to the Yakuza dying out. Again, literally dying out. Now, obviously, it's not only the Yakuza who will have this kind of tattoo, even this kind of full body irezumi tattoo. There are festivals in Japan that celebrate it, and not everyone that goes to these festivals is a Yakuza. But they are so intrinsically associated with Yakuza. This is the reason that you cannot show tattoos in any area that requires kanko. Involves public nudity, so public baths, onsens, places like that. They are generally a little more relaxed when it comes to Westerners because they understand that they don't have the same association. But yeah, this is why they're so against tattoos. The history of irezumi is actually quite interesting. It relates to a couple of things. In very early Japan, criminals would be tattooed once they were caught as a way of showing that you were a criminal. These were generally like a ring around the finger or the wrist, or directly on your forehead, but particularly with the ones on the hands, people would get a tattoo around it to help hide it. There were also the machiyako that I mentioned earlier. A lot of those were firefighters, and they tended to favour tattoos because obviously firefighters are exposed to a lot of heat. And when you're exposed to a lot of heat, you don't want to be wearing a lot of clothing, but you still kind of want to look you don't want to look like you're naked. And having this kind of tattoo sort of makes it look like you've got clothes on. So it was kind of less outrageous for them to be running around with their tops off, because it still looked like they had clothes on. There was also just a general fad. Yes?
You mentioned about the Machiyako being firefighters.
Yeah.
Now, I know that the sort of Edo era firefighters, they had kind of a glorified protection racket going on, where if you didn't pay up, then they wouldn't actually hose down your house when it was on fire. So, like, now all of the stuff that you were saying before about, like, protection of people kind of makes sense. So basically, it's just a glorified protection racket.
You know something else about their methods? There wasn't a lot of water around, right? So they just knocked down the house that was on fire to avoid the fire spreading to all the houses next to it. Okay, so then there was a fad for this kind of tattooing during the Edo period. Everyone was into it because the water margin, or suikoden, had just been released, and this features a lot of tales of brave Chinese gangsters who had extensive tattoos. So a lot of people were really into that, decided to get tattoos just to be like their heroes in the book.
So it's fan art. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
God, can't
Yeah. So having this kind of extensive tattooing is also a way of proving your commitment to the Yakuza life. It stops you from doing certain things like bathing in public houses. And the imagery that is used is usually selected not just by you, but also very much by your artist. The artists who do the tattooing are extremely highly respected, and they will choose what they think is the most suitable imagery for you. The most popular images tend to be cherry blossoms, which have always symbolized the fleeting nature of pleasure in life in Japan. Gods and heroic figures, particularly those from the Suikoden. And if you are familiar with the Like a Dragon series, I imagine a lot of you are, the tattoos that Kiryu and Nishikiyama have are very, very popular designs for the Yakuza. The dragon is a symbol of extreme power, but the carp, the one that Nishikiyama has, the folktale is that the carp fights its way upstream all its life, and when it finally gets to its goal, it becomes a dragon. So having a dragon tattoo symbolises that you are powerful. Having a carp symbolises that you are willing to work your way up the ranks. Right, so have I done this? Sorry, I have put my slides back to front. Okay. The Yakuza operate on a very strict hierarchical basis. It's basically a pyramid scheme. People on the lower levels have to pay the people on the level above them. So the person at the top gets kind of the largest percentage of this. The people at the bottom don't get anything at all. They're referred to as the oyabon. This is like the person on the top level, and the kobon. These words mean foster father and foster son. The overall head is known as the kunicho or kaicho, which is like a word that means chairman. Different groups use different terminologies. Generally, the kunicho will have kind of pseudo younger brothers, which are in this image, the sate gashira. And the waka gashira is like their top son. Their first lieutenant, and then each one of them might then have their own kobon, and it goes down and down. They use family-related terms. They will call each other oyaji, father, ojiki, uncle, or aniki, older brother, as signs of respect for the people who are above them in the hierarchy. And this Yakuza family is expected to take priority over your actual family, to the point where you will take a bullet for your oyabon, or you will go to jail instead of him. Serious infractions against this code can lead to death, sometimes by ritual or encouraged suicide, or expulsion, which is a really serious thing for the member because they can no longer function in the underworld, but they also can't go back to normal life. So the foster father and son relationship isn't legally recognized, but some Yakuza will, some Oyabun will literally adopt their Kobun. But it's made official within the group itself by the Sakizaki ritual, which is a very serious ceremony that reflects traditional Shinto ceremonies for adoption and for weddings. It's a sign of linking yourself to the other person. So sake is poured into ceremonial cups. The oyabun and the kobun will drink from them in a prescribed fashion. The oyabun will always be the one who drinks first, and then whatever sake they leave is drunk by the kobun. And then the kobun will take the empty sake cup and put it in his sleeve as a sign of taking that new relationship with him wherever he goes. There's also a similar ritual that takes place if two groups decide to form an alliance. They will perform sakazaki together, and it's treated with great reverence. And the other most famous ritual among the Yakuza is the yubitsume, which is the ritualized cutting off of finger joints as an act of penance. This goes back a long way and historically wasn't only performed by criminals and gangsters. For example, courtesans in medieval Japan would show their loyalty to their favored customer by cutting off their finger and giving it to them. But to the Yakuza, it's very much penance or apology. If they've committed an act that requires serious penance, but not so serious that they need to die for it, they will be expected to cut off one or more of their finger joints, starting from the little finger, and then present it to the person that they've offended. The person they've offended is expected to keep it. So you would end up with, like, Yakuza bosses having a jar full of severed finger joints.
What would happen if you have a complete mess up of a Yakuza who actually just runs out of fingers?
You kill them. They got no fingers, they die.
So it's said this practice originated during the times when swords were the favoured weapons, because you actually, when you're holding a sword, a lot of the balance of it is from the little finger, and if you remove that, you are no longer able to use a sword in the same way, and that means you have to rely on the people around you. It's basically you're going, I'm such a mess up that I can't be trusted, and I have to rely on everyone else to work for me. According to a police study in 1992, around 40% of all Yakuza had to do this at least once, of which 60% had done it while they were quite low in the ranks. There was one legendary boss in the Sumiyoshi Kai syndicate who was nicknamed Kani-san, which means Mr. Crab, because he'd had to perform it so many times that he was left with only the thumbs and index fingers of each hand. The practice has lost favour over the years because it's an extremely obvious sign that you're a Yakuza. It's a lot harder to hide than tattoos, which you can just cover up with clothing. Nowadays, most people who have lost a digit in this way will have a prosthetic to try and keep it from being obvious. Oh, I didn't mention, yes, when a kobun is required to do this, occasionally their oyabun will elect to do it for them, and this is a way of the oyabun saying, I'm sorry my underling is such a screw up, I'm responsible for him, and this is me apologising for both of us. So there's 6 major syndicates or families within the Yakuza as of 2023. These are the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi, the Kizunakai, the Ikeda-gumi, the Sumiyoshi-kai, and the Inagawa-kai. The Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi split from the Yamaguchi-gumi, and the Kizunakai and Ikeda-gumi split from the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi. They're all battling each other. The 3 largest families, the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Sumiyoshi-kai, and the Inagawa-kai, have formed an alliance. So they're a very significant force. And these 6 syndicates make up around 70% of the total Yakuza membership and associations in Japan. Obviously, there are smaller syndicates, but they're just nothing like as significant. Each of these groups have different codes, they focus on different revenue avenues. There is a saying within the Yakuza that the Yamaguchi-gumi could cost you your life, the Inagawa-kai will cost you your life savings, and the Sumiyoshi-kai is all talk. Okay, so, who is going to join a group like this? Much like the original Bakuto and Tekiya, membership does tend to be formed from people from outcast communities. The Burakumin class or caste was legally abolished in 1871, but discrimination against people who were perceived to be Burakumin continued because they would have particular surnames, and these surnames were inextricably linked to the idea of them being Burakumin. They accounted for about 70% membership of the Yamaguchi-gumi in the 1980s. And then ethnic Koreans, another group which has long faced discrimination in Japan, make up a significant number. In the early 1990s, 18 of the 19 top bosses of the Inagawa-kai were ethnic Korean. The Japanese National Police Agency suggested Koreans compose around 10% of the Yakuza. There is a particular irony to this because of the traditionalist and nationalistic origins of the Yakuza groups. But unfortunately, it is one of the only ways that ethnic Korean people have been able to acquire significant status and power in Japan. Also, the Yakuza like to think of themselves as being as embracing outcasts and underdogs and providing a way for these people to find a community. According to a 2006 speech by Mitsuhiro Suganuma, former officer of the Public Security Intelligence Agency, about 60% of Yakuza members come from these former Burakumin, 30% are Japanese-born Koreans, and only 10% are from outside of these groups. And also, as is unfortunately the case with organised crime all over the world, the vast majority of these members they come from poverty. Without having the resources and education to attain success and status by legal methods, they turn to illegal methods instead. They're tempted by the seemingly easy money and power that it affords, and the Yakuza took advantage of this. They would recruit from the Bosuzoku or biker gangs, and just sort of general hooligans, anyone who was on the fringes of the law and social acceptance, because it was just a lot easier to convince these people to join up. So I've used he/him pronouns an awful lot. There's a reason for this. You ask Yakuza, are there women in the Yakuza? There are no women in the Yakuza. It's not strictly true. There have been examples of Yakuza chairmen's wives taking over control of groups after their husbands have died. And they've been allowed to do this because they've been so close to it that they have the knowledge and the resources needed to continue running the group. But this is generally only permitted until a suitable Kobun has been chosen to take over the group formally. That's Hibari Tori from Way of the House Husband. That's exactly her situation. Wives might also be involved on the periphery of things. They might manage individual businesses within the portfolio. They might help with dealing drugs. They might take care of the young affiliates. But there is one woman, this badass bitch right here, who did take part in the Sakazaki ceremony. She is the only recorded woman to ever have done so. Her name is Nichimuro Maku. She was a child of government officials, but she rebelled against her father, who was strict and abusively authoritarian. And she joined a biker gang. She learned to fight, and eventually she met up with the Yakuza, got together with him, and he got her involved in the activities of his group. And she got the attention of another local group when she took part in a fight to save this boyfriend of hers. And she did so well in this fight that the boss was like, I'm interested in you, and recruited her. She wore a man's kimono when she took part in the ceremony, and she was essentially treated as a man throughout her career within this group. She did take part in the finger cutting as well, and apparently did such a good job with it, was so completely unfazed by it, that other members who were too nervous about doing it for themselves would ask her to do it for them. She did become disillusioned with Yakuza activities. She ran away, but because she was missing a finger and she had the tattoos, she couldn't get a job. So she ended up marrying the boss of another group, but he was abusive, so they divorced. She tried to rejoin her old group, but the boss wasn't the man that he used to be, and she couldn't find the same level of respect for him. So she did end up leaving the life altogether. She found work in the demolition business and currently lives a quiet life. She also manages a branch of a charity that seeks to provide aid to former Yakuza, helps them get into jobs and things like that. So what do they actually do? Obviously crime. What kind? As I mentioned earlier, there's still a very strong link between stores at the Japanese matsuri. Gambling houses are still frequently run by Yakuza. Pachinko parlors, the bizarre but wildly popular hobby where you just sit in front of a machine that pings balls around for you. Generally run by Yakuza, or generally the ethnic Korean members for some reason, or they're under Yakuza control. Debt collection, also a prime source of income. Syndicates will buy debt from legitimate businesses, so if you owe the bank money and the bank doesn't have the resources to keep pestering you to pay it back, the Yakuza will pay the bank this amount of money and take on that debt, and they will then come after you using their own methods, which are a bit more persuasive, and they will also charge extortionate rates of interests, because they know that they can get away with it, because otherwise you're afraid that they're going to kill you. More recently, drugs have been a prime source of income for the Yakuza. The main drug that they traffic is methamphetamine, or speed, which was actually developed in Japan by a man named Nagahiroshi Nagai in 1893. It was legal for some time, which meant that a lot of people started using it, became dependent on it. It was criminalized, they were still dependent on it, so they had to acquire it illegally. The Yakuza decided to take that on. It is the most widely abused drug in Japan, which is generally a country that doesn't have a lot of drug abuse, but methamphetamine is the highest, has the highest usage rate. A lot of Yakuza are in fact methamphetamine addicts themselves. They make use of the group's channels to get their own fix. And occasionally, attacks on other groups are the result of meth usage causing them to become violent and paranoid. They're not always sanctioned attacks. Yakuza will also traffic cocaine and heroin a lot less commonly. They will use these drugs as a method of control for the people that they have trafficked, because they get them addicted to the drugs. Unfortunately, they are then reliant upon the Yakuza bosses to continue supplying them with drugs, and are unable to escape because of this reliance. Real estate. If you've played the games, you might remember the minigame where you run an estate agency. Real estate fraud is a money spinner for the Yakuza, and as is stock fraud. And in Yakuza, the original game, that the whole plot line arches around the acquisition of a small plot of land in the middle of a territory. This is really accurate. Groups encourage the owners of these small plots of land to sell them via methods like blackmail, threat, antisocial activity, convincing people that A, they want to move out of there, and also helping to drop the property value. And then they can parcel these little bits of land up into bigger bits of land, which are therefore more valuable. Ownership of a lot of property also gives you a lot of influence over that area and means you can control what kind of things go on there. Protection rackets. One of the best known methods for collecting these. In essence, they offer their protection to small businesses for a fee, a small fee, which gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They do actually protect these small businesses from like local small criminal elements. They will drive away local hooligans. They will stop vandalism and things like that from happening. But also, if you don't pay up your protection money, you suddenly lose protection from that group itself. They will then feel justified in the use of violence and destruction to either eliminate the business or force them to start paying up protection money again, often at a higher level. There's a more specialized form of extortion called sokaiya, which is employed for larger businesses. The Yakuza will buy just enough stocks in the company to allow them to attend the shareholder meetings, and they will then threaten the business owners with blackmail, or they'll disrupt the meetings with ridiculous behavior, like shouting "Banzai" all the time, or yelling loud praises for the emperor, essentially meaning that the meeting can't function until you pay them off and just get them to stop doing that. The greatest income for Yakuza groups in 2010s and 2020s is from something called tokushinsagi, or special fraud. This is responsible for over 10%, or was responsible for over 10% of arrests of Yakuza members in 2014, and almost 35% of perpetrators of this kind of fraud in Japan were Yakuza and their associates. This fraud predominantly takes the form of taking advantage of elderly people, vulnerable people. They will call them up, pretend to be their family members, saying, "Oh, I'm in trouble, I really need help, I really need some money, can you send it to me?" Or they'll pretend to be employees of financial institutions who suddenly need payment for something. And elderly folk don't entirely understand what's going on, so they just pay up the money in the hope that the problem will be solved. This is very much a modern Yakuza activity, because the codes of conduct that used to be employed, particularly in the 1960s, have become a lot less significant over time. Yakuza at that time would have really looked down upon this kind of exploitation of vulnerable, ordinary civilians. This is the really grim stuff, I do apologise. Sex work has always been a rich source of income for the Yakuza. A lot of it is not illegal in Japan. Full penetrative penis in vagina sex is illegal. Well, the sale of such is illegal, but other sexual other sexual acts are not. And the law is generally quite poorly enforced. Solicitation and management of sex workers is illegal and has been since 1958. So, in order to exploit loopholes, Yakuza tended to specialise in what is known as soapland, which is kind of a version of erotic massage. They provide a service where a woman will give your client a bath. The woman just happens to be naked and might use different parts of her own body to wash the client. And if that happens to result in more than just a clean body for the client, then, that's fine and good. But it's not officially what it's for. They might agree to have penetrative sex with a customer, but that is not part of the job. That is an agreement that might just so happen to take place after a significant tip. But officially, that's just two consenting adults having a good time with each other. Pornography, unfortunately, including pornography that features minors, is also an income stream for the Yakuza. During the 60s and 70s, when Japan's economy was doing very well and tourism was becoming a very popular hobby for Japanese people, the Yakuza would offer sex tours of other Asian countries where, of course, were very cheap. A lot of hostess clubs are also run by Yakuza groups, something else that the games are accurate on. Similarly to the soap bands, sex is not technically a part of hostess work, but hostesses may choose to have sex with their customers, especially the ones who spend a significant amount of money on them. The choice is not always much of a choice. They will also use other seemingly legitimate establishments like cafes, bars, or restaurants as fronts for brothels. They might seem completely ordinary on the front, but they are somehow staffed only by very attractive women who may choose to willingly have sex with a customer outside of work. The workers at these establishments are almost inevitably victims of human trafficking, usually from Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. They're offered what sounds like simple and lucrative work, but then they get their passports seized and they are essentially forced into indentured servitude, whereby they have to pay back their management to have any kind of freedom at all. Obviously, this will come at outrageous cost. And as I mentioned earlier, they are frequently given drugs, getting them addicted, meaning that they need to continue their supply, continue working in order to get their supply. Sadly, attempts to leave tend to result in their disappearances, and police rarely offer very much support for these women because they are not in the country legally. Slightly more cheerfully, money laundering, also a very traditional income source, done by various seemingly legitimate enterprises. The orphanage Kiryu ends up running in one of the games. Yeah, that happened. To outside eyes, it seems like they're doing good, but they're really not. Almost nothing is done without it being somehow profitable for them. Other enterprises which are used are the entertainment industry, which still has a strong Yakuza backing even now, which might explain why a lot of films and media portray them as quite glamorous. Teen idols groups might be managed by Yakuza. They're also heavily into the sumo wrestling scene and the professional wrestling scene as well. And the construction industry is a great way for them to launder money. Again, they are legitimately building these buildings, but it gives them an avenue to launder the money, and it gives them influence over a local area, as well as arranging for kickbacks from local politicians who perhaps want an area to be gentrified. One avenue that's not about profit, but more about power, is political lobbying and influence. There's long been a relationship between the Yakuza and politicians, to the point where prominent politicians would hire Yakuza as bodyguards, including for visiting foreign dignitaries and US presidents. President Eisenhower, for example, when he visited Japan, had Yakuza bodyguards following him around. They'll arrange for large audiences at political rallies. They'll provide people to do, boots on the ground work, like fundraising. They'll provide extra votes. And in exchange for this, they get a degree of legitimacy and influence over government policy. Some of them have even served as government ministers. Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister who was assassinated in 2022, this assassination was very likely related, at least in part, to links with the Yakuza. Okay, so violence and murder, definitely a thing that happens. What forms does it take? Until relatively recently, it was generally between gangs in turf wars. One surprisingly accurate aspect in the games is the use of random street furniture in gang fights. So if you're wandering along the street and you've got a gun or a sword, the police can go, "You're off to a fight." If If you just happen to pick up a bicycle, start smashing someone over the head with it, well, that's spontaneous. You just got caught up in the moment, right? Same with a baseball bat. Just going to the batting cages, officer. There happened to be a fight here, I got involved. Guns were frowned upon for a long time as being dishonourable weapons because they don't require real skill. You can just point a trigger and shoot someone. But they became more popular over time because the Yakuza were influenced by portrayals of American gangsters. There was also code about when it was acceptable to engage in inter-gang violence. If you were doing it during a significant ceremonial event, like a Sakazaki event, or a funeral, that was really bad form. But it did occasionally happen, and it tended to result in really super escalation of gang war. So why have they been allowed to continue for so long, basically in the open? As well as having political influence and legitimate business ventures, they've had a surprisingly positive public image for a long time. To the average person in the street who is not exposed to a lot of the sides of their activities, it seems like they are protecting ordinary folks. They are rooting out vandals, like just individual local criminals. They will stop that kind of activity. The violent activity was normally kept between the groups themselves. The entertainment industry, which had strong Yakuza influence, were portraying them positively. Yakuza groups have actually performed genuine acts of charity. When there have been earthquakes, they've provided aid. And because they're not tied up by the same kind of red tape as a lot of legitimate businesses, it was a lot easier for them to do that. And this has led to a kind of weird lionizing of the Yakuza, including the publication of actual fan magazines, which list the more salubrious activities of groups and rank them regularly in popularity. Groups also play into this. For example, the Inigo Akai actually have a theme song. I'll play it for you in a second. One study in 2011 found that 1 in 10 adults in Japan under the age of 40 believe that the Yakuza should be allowed to exist. But this is changing. I'll only play a bit because I am already running over time, but this is... Yeah.
That's not the thing.
I don't think we have a sound. I'm very sorry, but yeah, you can see like the imagery that they're portraying here. And this would be played on national TV. Okay, so, I mean, how do they perceive themselves? We've mentioned that they're known by different names. The ones they favour for themselves are the extreme path, or Gokudo, which is a reference to the traditional samurai values of Bushido. They're traditionally they are generally very traditional in their values, as we've seen by their treatment of women, for a start. They genuinely believe they are helping local communities. They see themselves as Robin Hood figures. And they would wear their group emblems in public with pride until police crackdowns made that a bad idea. The codes that they followed tended to involve things as don't involve civilians in Yakuza affairs, don't buy or sell drugs, although as we've seen that clearly didn't work out very well. Don't commit sexual crimes, don't commit petty crime. There was one story about a group, and one of them turned up with a bag full of chewing gum and was offering it out. And the boss came along and said, "Where is this from?" And the guy said, "I shoplifted it from that shop down there." And the boss actually started choking him out because he was so offended that you would commit this petty crime. But, you know, all the other crime, that's fine. Police and the Yakuza, why have they not dealt with them? They've had a weird relationship with the Yakuza over the years. As I said, groups literally provide lists of their members to the police because they wanted to be seen as cooperating. for quite a lot of time, there were no actual laws against a lot of the activities that they took part in. And where the laws existed, there were loopholes that could be exploited. Or there wasn't a lot of interest in enforcing them very strongly. There was a degree of gratitude towards the Yakuza for preventing this kind of ordinary street crime and thereby protecting Japan's public image as an extremely safe country. And of course, there were corrupt elements within the police who were receiving kickbacks from them in exchange for turning a blind eye. But there have been a number of concerted attempts to tackle the problem. Started notably in the 1960s when a large number of arrests of prominent Yakuza figures took place. As a result, crime declined. The number of general Yakuza fell from about 59. Sorry, I don't understand what I've written here. I was literally finishing this last night and I think it shows. Yeah, so the number of Yakuza organizations and members declined from about 5,216 organizations and 184,000 members in 1963 to 3,500 organizations and 139,000 members in 1969. On the other hand, when they got released from jail, they just went straight back to it. So the mass arrests needed to happen again in 1970 and in 1975. And around this period, there was a recession in Japan, which made activities more difficult for the Yakuza, and it meant that the numbers never quite recovered. In 1992, there was an act passed that outlawed 27 acts that were commonly performed by Yakuza groups, including demanding hush money or donations. Collecting debts became illegal, conducting land grabbing activities became illegal, and demanding protection money also. That caused numbers to fall steeply once again, dropping by about a third in the 10 years following the initial development of the Act in 1991. During this time, the police and a media, at police request, started to use the term Boryokudan to refer to the Yakuza, which meant violent gangs. It was an attempt to change the public perception of them from being these glamorous, honourable villains to actually just a bunch of criminals. From 2008 to 2011, further laws were enacted, including the allowance of prosecution of leaders for acts that were being perpetrated by the people below them. And the Yakuza exclusion ordinances came into effect. These forbade businesses from offering benefits to any known Yakuza, and it made ordinary life a lot more difficult for Yakuza members. They couldn't do things like open bank accounts, get credit cards, get mobile phone contracts. They could no longer lease property legally. It became illegal to print business cards that had names of a Yakuza organization on them. If you know business cards in Japan, that's kind of significant. It's taken way too long, but it has genuinely helped in stamping out Yakuza activities, and it has been instrumental in their extreme decline. It may well be that within the next 20 to 40 years, the Yakuza will cease to exist entirely. That was a lot. I'm sorry. And don't let it stop you from enjoying media, right? Like, it's good. Just don't mix it up too much with reality. These are some of my favourite Yakuza media. If you like the serious stuff, you might want to check out the movies. If you like the more light-hearted stuff, I love these three. You've got Yakuza in Domestic Bliss, you've got Yakuza who gets into K-pop, and you've got Yakuza who starts a cat cafe. And I could not get half the stuff I wanted to talk about into this panel. If you would like to know more, please take a photo of this slide. This is where I got a lot of my sources, primarily from the Yakuza Japan's Criminal Underworld book, originally published in the 80s. There is an updated version that was published more recently that has been included a bit more of the more recent stuff. So, thank you very much. Sorry for talking so quickly.